Hey, music lovers! Buckle up, because we're about to unravel one of the most intriguing chapters in rock and roll history. Picture this, the Beatles, the biggest band ever, ruling the world with their catchy songs and charming smiles. But behind the scenes, there's a tangled web of friendships, betrayals, and maybe even a hint of romance. Today, we're zooming in on the complex relationship between Paul McCartney, Cynthia Lennon, and John Lennon. Was Paul just a loyal friend to Cynthia after her heartbreaking divorce from John, or was there something deeper brewing? And could this have sparked tension that helped tear the Beatles apart? Trust me, you're going to want to stick around until the end, because we're digging up some juicy details that'll blow your mind. Let's travel back to the 1960s, when the Beatles were more than a band, they were a cultural earthquake. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were young, talented, and living the dream. But fame comes with a price. And for these guys, that price included messy personal lives. At the center of our story are three key players: John, the rebellious genius with a sharp tongue; Cynthia, his first wife who stood by him in the early days; and Paul, the charming bassist and John's songwriting soulmate. These three were connected in ways that were beautiful, complicated, and sometimes downright dramatic. To get the full picture, we need to start in 1962, when John and Cynthia said, "I do." John and Cynthia's marriage began with love and hope. They were a young couple, and in 1963, they welcomed their son, Julian. But as the Beatles' fame exploded, their relationships started to crumble. John was swept up in the whirlwind of tours, screaming fans, and creative pressures. By 1968, he'd fallen for Yoko Ono, an artist who brought a new spark into his life. John didn't hold back when talking about his marriage to Cynthia, calling it boring and saying Yoko was the one who saved him. Those are some bold words, especially about someone you shared a child with. When they divorced, John moved on fast, marrying Yoko and diving into a new chapter. Cynthia, meanwhile, was left in the UK, raising Julian and facing a world that seemed to turn its back on her. Here's where the story takes a turn. After the divorce, John laid down the law. He wanted everyone in the Beatles' inner circle to cut Cynthia off. No calls, no visits, nothing. It was like he wanted to erase her from their lives. But one person refused to follow John's orders: Paul McCartney. Imagine Cynthia, probably feeling lonely and betrayed, hearing a knock at her door one sunny afternoon. She opens it, and there's Paul, holding a single red rose. He sits with her, looks her in the eye, and says he's sorry about the divorce. He tells her John was wrong to treat her that way. That moment must have felt like a lifeline. Paul wasn't just checking in. He was defying John, his best friend and bandmate, to do what he thought was right. In her memoir, Cynthia wrote about this with so much gratitude. She called Paul the only Beatle brave enough to stand up to John. She described him as his own man, someone who didn't bow to John's intensity. That's huge, because John could be intimidating. He had a way of commanding loyalty, and most people in the Beatles circle followed his lead. But not Paul. This tells us something special about the bond between Paul and Cynthia. It wasn't just a casual friendship. It was deep, meaningful, and built on mutual respect. But here's the million-dollar question: was it purely platonic? Or was there a spark of something more? Let's talk about Julian, because Paul's kindness didn't stop with Cynthia. He made a point to support her son too. After the divorce, Julian was just a kid caught in the middle of his parents' drama. Paul saw that and stepped up in a big way. He wrote a song for Julian called "Hey Jules," which later became the iconic "Hey Jude." You know the lyrics? And anytime you feel the pain, hey Jude, refrain, don't carry the world upon your shoulders. Those words feel like a warm embrace, written to comfort a little boy going through a tough time. Paul didn't have to do that, but he did. And guess what? Hey Jude wasn't just a sweet gesture, it became one of the Beatles' biggest hits, with over 480 million streams on Spotify today. That song shows Paul's heart. He wasn't just there for Cynthia. He cared about Julian's happiness too. It's moments like these that make you wonder about Paul's motives. Was he just being a great friend, stepping in to help a family in need? Or did he have feelings for Cynthia that went beyond friendship? The rose, the visits, the song, they all paint a picture of someone who cared deeply. But before we jump to conclusions, let's shift gears and look at Paul and John's relationship, because that's where things get really messy. In the early days, John and Paul were like brothers. They wrote songs together, shared dreams, and built the Beatles from the ground up. Their chemistry was magic. Think "I Want to Hold Your Hand" or "She Loves You." But as the band grew, so did the cracks in their friendship. By 1967, things were starting to shift. That year, they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that's still hailed as a masterpiece. It was bold, colorful, and captured the rebellious spirit of the 60s. But behind the scenes, Paul and John were on different wavelengths. Paul was full of ideas, taking charge of the album's concept, while John was struggling with personal issues. John later said he felt low during the making of E.G.T. Pepper, while Paul was brimming with confidence. That difference in energy created tension. E.G. Pepper was Paul's baby, and John felt like he was taking a back seat. Fans and critics started noticing the power struggle too. Small arguments turned into bigger conflicts, and their once-tight bond began to fray. Things got worse in 1970 when Paul announced that the Beatles were breaking up. John was livid. He felt like Paul was acting like the boss, making it seem like he started the band and decided to end it. To John, it was a public humiliation. He wanted his voice to matter, and Paul's announcement made him feel like it didn't. That moment marked a breaking point in their friendship, but the drama didn't end there. In 1971, Paul released his solo album Ram, which included a song called Too Many People. John heard it and thought the lyrics were a jab at him and Yoko. He wasn't wrong, Paul later admitted. The song was partly about John. In response, John hit back hard with How Do You Sleep on his Imagine album. The lyrics were vicious, calling Paul out and even referencing a crazy rumor that Paul had died and been replaced. It was like a musical slap fight, and fans were shocked. These two weren't just arguing. They were using their art to take shots at each other. It's wild to think that the guys who wrote All You Need Is Love could get so bitter now. Let's circle back to Cynthia. Could Paul's closeness with her have added fuel to the fire between him and John? Think about it. John wanted everyone to cut Cynthia off, but Paul did the opposite. He visited her, supported Jillian, and showed her kindness when John was trying to move on with Yoko. To John, that might have felt like a betrayal. He was already sensitive about his new life with Yoko, and seeing his best friend stay close to his ex-wife could have stung. We don't have direct evidence that Paul's actions caused specific fights with John, but it's not hard to imagine it being a sore spot. The Beatles' breakup was a mix of many things: creative clashes, egos, business disputes, but Paul's bond with Cynthia could have been one piece of the puzzle. Let's dig deeper into Paul and Cynthia's relationship, because there's more to explore. In her memoir, Cynthia wrote about Paul's visits in vivid detail. She said he was the only Beatle who made an effort to stay in touch after the divorce. That's a big deal when you think about how tight the Beatles were as a group. George and Ringo didn't step up like Paul did. Cynthia also shared how Paul apologized for John's behavior, saying it wasn't right. These moments suggest a connection that was more than just casual. Paul wasn't obligated to do any of this, yet he went out of his way to show Cynthia and Julian he cared. It's hard not to see that as special, but here's where things get spicy. Over the years, fans and rumors have wondered if Paul and Cynthia had a romantic connection. Could there have been feelings bubbling under the surface? One story that's kept this speculation alive surfaced on social media in 2024. It claimed Paul bought letters that John wrote to Cynthia after their divorce, then returned them to her with a note telling her not to sell her memories. Sounds like something out of a romance novel, right? The story went viral, with one Facebook post getting over 140,000 reactions. But let's set the record straight. The truth is less dramatic but still sweet. Cynthia did sell some of John's letters after the divorce, and Paul bought one of them. He had it framed and gave it back to her as a kind gesture. This happened over years, not days, and there's no proof of a note with that exact message. Cynthia wrote about this in her memoirs, saying she was touched by Paul's thoughtfulness. She appreciated how he looked out for her and Julian, and that framed letter was a symbol of his care. But there's no evidence they were ever more than friends. The viral story got exaggerated, as things often do online, because fans love the idea of a hidden love story. It's easy to see why Paul's actions were so heartfelt, and the image of him handing Cynthia a rose or a framed letter feels cinematic. But without letters, interviews, or other proof from Paul or Cynthia, any romantic angle is just guesswork. So, what was really going on between Paul and Cynthia? Let's break it down. On one hand, Paul's actions scream friendship and sincerity. He saw Cynthia and Julian struggling and stepped up when others didn't, writing "Hey Jude," visiting with a rose, returning the letter. These are the moves of someone who's loyal and compassionate. Paul seems like the kind of guy who does what's right, even if it means going against the grain. On the other hand, it's understandable why people might wonder if there was more. He was defying John, spending time with his ex-wife and showing her a lot of attention. In a band already bursting with tension, that could have raised some eyebrows. Still, without solid evidence, we have to lean on what we know. Paul was a friend who cared deeply. Let's take a moment to look at John. Because his actions add another layer to this drama, John wasn't exactly known for holding back. After the divorce, he made harsh comments about Cynthia, calling their marriage boring and praising Yoko for bringing excitement into his life. Those words must have hurt Cynthia, especially since they had Julian together. John also had a knack for stirring up trouble. In 1966, he made headlines by saying the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. That comment sparked a massive backlash, especially in the US, where people burned Beatles records and sent death threats. John had to apologize, but it showed he could be impulsive and didn't always think about the consequences of his words that impulsiveness spilled into his relationships. John and Paul's friendship, once unbreakable, started to crumble in the late 60s. The Sgt. Pepper era was a turning point, with Paul taking more control and John feeling disconnected. Their creative differences grew and personal struggles like John's emotional lows and Paul's ambition drove them further apart. The public breakup announcement and their solo album jabs only deepened the rift. It's telling that after the Beatles split, other band members like George and Ringo worked together, but John and Paul never did. That shows how fractured their bond had become. Could Paul's support for Cynthia have been one of the many factors that pushed them apart? It's possible, but it's just one piece of a very complicated puzzle. As we near the end, let's reflect on what this story means. The Beatles weren't just a band. They were real people with real emotions, conflicts, and choices. Paul's kindness to Cynthia and Julian shows a side of him that's warm, loyal, and unafraid to stand up for what's right. Whether his bond with Cynthia was purely friendship or something more, it was a bright spot in a tough time for her. Meanwhile, the tension between Paul and John reminds us that even the closest friendships can break under pressure. The Beatles' breakup wasn't caused by one thing, it was a mix of egos, creative clashes, personal struggles, and maybe even a touch of drama involving Cynthia. But let's not forget the bigger picture. The Beatles gave us music that still resonates today. Songs like Hey Jude, born out of Paul's care for Julian, remind us of the human stories behind the hits. Paul's actions, whether driven by friendship or something deeper, show the power of kindness in tough times. John's bold personality, flaws and all, helped make the Beatles unforgettable. And Cynthia, often overlooked, was a strong woman who raised Julian and kept her dignity through all. Their story is a reminder that even legends have their share of heartbreak, loyalty, and mystery. So, what's your take? Do you think Paul was just being a great friend to Cynthia, or could there have been unspoken feelings? And do you believe his actions played a role in the rift with John? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm dying to hear what you think. This journey into the Beatles world has been wild, and I hope you've loved it as much as I have. If you enjoyed this deep dive, give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from music history. Let's keep the conversation going, and I'll see you in the next video.